distracting, because there are so many things that we need to think about with that patient, and a doctor who's in charge also has to stay on top of that patient's care. We have to make sure the nurse is doing the right thing, that the therapist is doing the right thing, that the dietary department, the pharmacy is all on top of everything that you want done. And sometimes it's very difficult to do because there are so many different variables, but that's what we have to do. And if
so
it's
kind of like an assembly line.
It is kind of an assembly line, and
what I witnessed was an assembly line with no quality control. That it was just one blatant, I don't even want to call it a mistake, but just, it was, my father received inhumane treatment. He really did. And I believe that anyone that received the treatment that he received would not have survived. I know if I was treated the way he was treated, I would not have survived. And that's what I have a problem with. And then I have an additional problem when I did go to the patient representative and I did started reporting it to the different government agencies. No one really wanted to look at it. And I was standing right there watching it. I witnessed it. And we can prove it with the medical records.
I think things are going to change now. I think there have been a number of situations and issues in the recent past, and I think the Department of Health is going to take a more active role.
We have a new governor now. We have a new governor. So.
Politicians also will take an active role. I think people are becoming more and more informed, and the more informed the person becomes, the more issues that they start to raise, and the more complaints they start to register. And believe me, I think the Department of Health looks at every complaint. They're obligated to look at every complaint. And
well, we had the Department of Health looked at my complaint, and they didn't see anything. I got the letter that everything was well documented, supported by the interviews conducted, and goodbye, case closed. They believe me, but they can't prove it. And by that time, we bought the medical records, and I went back in person with the medical records, and I made several phone calls. How do you consider this well documented? What does this agency do? And based on my appeal, they did a complete turnaround, and it went from everything was well documented to nothing was documented. So I really have to question the competence or the level of investigation that they're actually doing. And then I put in another complaint, several other complaints with more concerns, and they refused to investigate. And just so that you know the history of this, there was a doctor upstate who was sexually abusing children. This is all documented. And people were reporting it to the New York State Department of Health and the Office of Professional Medical Conduct. And there was no law requiring the Department of Health to report potential criminal activity to the local law enforcement personnel. So the Department of Health knew that there was abuse taking place, and they took no action. Finally, what happened is a family member went to the police investigated, they arrested the doctor. When they arrested the doctor, 100 other people came forward and said, yes, my child was also abused. So now there's a public health law, Chapter 542, requiring the New York State Department of Health, if they see evidence of criminality, there's a law for them to report it to the local law enforcement. But if they don't comply with the public health law, they're protected by the New York State Attorney General's office. If you want to take the Department of Health to court, the Attorney General would defend the Department of Health in a courtroom.
Well, I think what you mentioned about changing legislation is very important. Most of the governmental agencies, they work within their guidelines, within their rules and within their regulations. However, if legislation is changed, like in the example that you just gave, then there's another standard that they need to meet. So,
but to me, if you're reporting and you're reporting it in good faith, what you perceive to be criminal activity, and the Department of Health sees evidence of criminal activity, I mean, they need a law to tell them to report it to the police or the district attorney's office?
Not that a law is needed, but a lot of times an investigation can only go so far. And unless you have a person come forward and say, I was the one who was abused, it happened to me, then it may be very difficult to prove something. It's a very touchy situation. You really need someone coming forward who's been the victim. And I'm sure
if the victim is dead, the victim can't come forward. That's part of the problem. Well, now let me go to a statistic, because I went to a few rallies recently and I picked up some literature. 7,000 New Yorkers are being killed in hospitals every year. Does that sound like an accurate figure to you? That's the figure that they're giving. We believe it's higher.
Well, it may even be higher. You're right. It may be higher. The fact is that there are patients that are dying as a result of medical errors. You're absolutely right. Whether the figure is 7,000 or 700,000, it shouldn't happen.
Right.
Even if it's one, it should not happen.
It's one too many.
If it can be preventable, then it needs to be prevented. And we need to identify how it happens. And I think we've covered a number of issues here with taking an active role, asking questions, making sure your personal doctor is involved. One of the things that a lot of hospitals are doing now, they're hiring physician extenders and nurse extenders. And I think it's important for a patient...
Now, what does that mean? Assistants?
Yes. Examples of physician extenders are physician assistants and nurse practitioners. And examples of nurse extenders are clinical care associates. And I think it's important for a patient to identify that, or confirm even, that it's their personal doctor who's in charge of the care, who's in charge of the invasive procedure, who's performing the invasive procedure, that it's the doctor, not the physician assistant, not the nurse practitioner,
who's not as well qualified,
associate.
Not as well schooled, obviously.
Not as well qualified, not as well experienced, works on shifts. There's a lack of continuity of care. There's a lack of communication. That's where I think one of the problem lies. If we need to have one person that's in charge of the patient, it needs to be the doctor. And the patient or the advocate needs to be sure that it's the doctor who is aware of all that's going on. You certainly can't blame a doctor if they don't know that something happened, or a medication that was given improperly, or a procedure was done.
Well, let's say that's brought to their attention.
Brought to the doctor's attention.
Yes.
Oh, then that if a problem has been brought to a doctor's attention, then that doctor is obligated to report that problem to the administration of the hospital. And if he or she believes that the hospital administration hasn't investigated it properly or adequately, then there's the next step. There's the local Department of Health. There's the State Department of Health. Sort of what you've been doing all along. You've taken a very active role.
For over 7 years, and I'm still reporting it.
And you need to be congratulated for that you haven't given up, because you've identified a problem, and despite everyone telling you that it isn't a problem, you still are persistent because you believe that there was a problem. And I think
multiple problems.
Yes, and I think your work and your efforts has made many, many strides with patient care, has improved patient care, and has saved lives.
Dr. Colantonio, I really appreciate you coming on my program today. I hope that we've been able to provide some information for the public.
Yes.
And there is a rally coming up.
Oh, yes, yes.
April 19th.
Yes, thank you very much. There is a march that we're going to have, a walk for patient safety. It's scheduled for April 19th of 2008. It's a Saturday. If you'd like more information, there's a website that just came online. It's called LeapforPatientSafety.org. It's all one word, LeapforPatientSafety.org.
Thank you, Dr. Colantonio.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Meryl. Please, thank you.
Thank you.
God bless. Thank you.